Hi, good evening, and welcome to the fifth in our series on big ideas that have changed the world or continue to change the world. This is a series that we've been doing in partnership with Keystone Positive Change Investment Trust, and it's been fantastic. And I'm incredibly excited about tonight's big idea, which is going to be about plastic. And the thing about plastic is that it wasn't here 100 years ago. And now, as I sit here, and as you will see behind me, I'm covered in plastic. I've got plastic in everything. And the person we're going to talk to about plastic is also something that is of huge pleasure to me. Elizabeth Kolbert is a New Yorker writer. She's the author of two extraordinary books, The Sixth Extinction, sorry, it's hard to say, as well as another book called Under a White Sky. Particularly the latter book looks at things that had unintended consequences, that people set off with really good intentions about trying to do something, as if any of you have read this book or not read this book, which I super recommend, set off with something that initially seemed like quite a bright idea as part of our general control of the environment, but then had a terrible backhanded slap and has landed us all in a big problem. And I would say that plastic is probably one of the tops of those kind of inventions. And we're going to talk about how it got invented, what a mess it's making, and then look at some of the ways we might get out of it, including some of the stuff that Elizabeth has written about in Under a White Sky to do with mechanical ways of maybe getting rid of plastic, but also getting rid of carbon. Details in the chat about both Elizabeth's books. She's a staff writer on the New Yorker, I think, staff, and she writes completely brilliant pieces. And in fact, the whole of this session about plastic is based on a fantastically long, wonderful piece that she recently wrote, which caught our eye. And I'm thrilled that she's joining us here from Massachusetts. So while it's good evening from me, it's good afternoon from Elizabeth. Elizabeth, welcome to 5 by 15. I'm thrilled that you're here again. And thank you very much for being with us.
Pleasure to be with you across the pond.
Good. So plastic, I mean, the thing is, where did it begin? What's the origin of it, and how did it creep up on us like this?
Well, it's actually interesting. There's a British origin story and an American origin story, and I confess that when I wrote about plastic, I offered only the American story. And the American story, which is I would have to say the more entertaining of the two stories, it involves a prize that was offered. This was actually in the middle of the Civil War, the U.S. Civil War, and it was a guy who was sort of the billiards king of the 1860s. And at that point, billiard balls were made from ivory, and elephant tusks were becoming very dear, very scarce already in the 1860s. And so this guy got the idea that he would sponsor a contest to come up with a replacement for ivory to make billiard balls. And two brothers from Albany, New York, got to tinkering, and they came up with this substance that involved, camphor basically, and mixing all sorts of gooey things together. And they came up with what they called celluloid. And this was the first commercially successful plastic. There had been a British scientist named Parkes, who had come up with a very similar invention a few years earlier, but it had never really taken off. And this one really took off. They formed a company, and they made not just billiard balls, but they made everything: combs and false teeth and knickknacks, and just across the board. And they advertised it, interestingly and perhaps paradoxically, as we'll discuss later, as a way to save these animals like elephants and tortoises. Tortoiseshell was being used for all sorts of jewelry and combs. Tortoises, coral was also being used very frequently in jewelry, that red coral that's now so rare. And they were going to save these creatures by creating these same items instead out of plastic, although it was not yet called plastic.
That's so interesting. I mean, that fits so well into the sorts of things that you write about, where you start out with a good mission to, as you say, save the coral. But when did plastic So it starts out obviously with things that are kind of nice and stuff like that. So when does it start to tip into the problem that we have today with it?
Well, I think, like a great many of these issues and problems that we have now, it's really becomes a post-war phenomenon. I mean, plastics really take off. A lot of plastics are used, and I don't want to say invented, but have strategic uses during World War II. And then the consumer use of plastic really takes off after World War II. And really even, and those of us who are old enough to remember would say really, really doesn't take off until maybe the 1980s or so, when we get things like, plastic shopping bags, which have become sort of the scourge of the planet in a lot of ways. So it's a relatively new phenomenon. You can, certainly go online and look at plastic production over time and see that kind of, ski slope. Well, I guess it's going up as opposed to down, but that sort of exponentially rising curve.
And we can't also forget that so much of plastic, say the whole of the health service, it depends on plastic. I mean, there is good plastic and then there's bad plastic.
Well, I mean, that's a really interesting, issue, and one man's good is another man's bad. I'm not sure that things divide quite so neatly, but certainly our healthcare system now is completely, reliant on sterile, single-use plastic, gloves and masks and all sorts of materials that are, that are only used once. Now, whether all of those are needed, I suspect even in our healthcare system, there's a lot of things that probably it's just more convenient to make them single use as opposed to actually medically necessary. But certainly we are not getting rid of plastic in many settings, but the vast majority of plastic we use, is not being used in healthcare settings, that's for sure.
When you get into things like single-use plastic on food, in a way, the plastic or the ability of the plastic made the industry happen, didn't it?
Yes, I'm sure, I really don't want to claim to be sort of an expert on, food packaging, but certainly a lot of the things that we now take for granted, of single servings and the way that we consume, when you go to the grocery store, if you were to try to do a shopping trip without plastic, you would be limited. You probably would, I'm not sure you'd be able to buy any, maybe there are some things that are still packaged in cardboard, but even those things may have a plastic liner. It would be very difficult for you to buy any kind of packaged food at this point, I think, that doesn't have some plastic or plastic coating involved.
Yes, and I think that it's a very easy one for the industry to defend, because I've argued against plastic, everyone has, and they say, well, it makes the food last longer. So there is this very complicated situation around things like plastic and poverty and food protection, as there is about the fact of plastic as convenience.
Yes, I think that you can make a very powerful argument that in many of the uses of plastic, and that the alternative is, I don't want to say worse, but potentially just as bad. Yes, if you're going to get increased food waste, for example, food spoilage without plastic packaging, then you are weighing things that are hard to, they're not quite commensurate. I'm not sure what metric you would use, but certainly you would say there are heavy costs to that.
So in your amazing piece, you come up with some pretty extraordinary statistics. I mean, like, how much plastic is there in the world?
Oh, wow. Just, I can't remember. Well, one statistic that I will offer, which I don't even think was in the piece, is that, there's now more plastic in the world, than there are living creatures. I mean, the weight of the biosphere and the weight of the plastics that we've created are I can't remember the exact statistics, but roughly analogous. So that's a pretty stunning figure. And every year, billions of pounds of plastic are created.
And where's the plastic ending up?
Well, it's ending up everywhere. A lot of it gets landfilled. That's if it's disposed of, properly. And the rest floats around. What's happening is plastics are also increasingly being used in the developing world. That's a huge, issue, and ending up blowing into, rivers. That's where you get a lot of this plastic being discharged into the oceans. It ends up in rivers, and then it ends up in the ocean. So I'm sure that most of our listeners tonight have heard about the great, Pacific garbage patch, which is this huge stretch of the Pacific, the sort of central Pacific, where there are, people imagine it as sort of a plastic soup. It isn't really that. A lot of these pieces of plastic are too small to see. But if you just, were to dip a bucket in it and analyze it, you'd find, these gazillions of little shards of plastic. And that's a result of all this plastic, as I say, just washing into the oceans.
But somehow in the Pacific garbage patch, it all holds together, yes, in some weird way.
It doesn't exactly hold together. It's just as a result of these ocean currents, it doesn't leave, it doesn't spread out. So it's sort of being concentrated in a way. Yeah.
So the big, well, there are many scares about plastic. And, it obviously gets eaten by fish, it gets whatever. But the world now of the microplastic, which it seems to me we're just beginning to get our heads around. Can you tell us about what is microplastic, and how does plastic become microplastic?
So microplastics, once again, there's no really strict definition. I think the definition that's usually used is a piece that's 5 millimeters or less in diameter, but that's kind of a rough approximation. So just basically very small pieces of plastic, and plastic becomes microplastic in a lot of different ways. The main way, I think, is probably just degradation. Everything is sloughing off plastic, the way you're sloughing off, skin cells or hair all the time. So when a piece of plastic enters into the garbage, however, either it's, tossed properly or not tossed properly, it starts to degrade. And even maybe many plastics are degrading that haven't even entered that. We are all wearing clothes made out of plastic now, and those are shedding fibers all the time. Every time we do the laundry, those shed fibers, and those end up getting dispersed into the environment. So it's a combination of things breaking down, plastic, that plastic bag that flew off and, got tangled in the trees and eventually ended up in the oceans. It got hit by a lot of UV radiation, from the sun. That degrades plastic very effectively. And then it got, bounced around by the waves. That degrades plastic. So it's always just degrading. These long polymers that make up plastic just are breaking down into smaller and smaller pieces.
So what's that doing both to the ocean, start with that maybe, and then what's it doing to us?
Well, I think that, right, there are these two issues. There's the one issue of what microplastics and macroplastics are doing to aquatic life, pretty much all of which is bad. Everyone has seen, horrific photos of turtles with the, plastic straws stuck up their, snouts, or animals that are entangled in fishing gear, plastic fishing gear, netting, or those 6-pack rings. Or, many studies have shown that, aquatic birds feed these bits of plastic to their young. They can fill up their bellies, and they basically starve to death. So those are all problems that are, acute for wildlife. And then for both wildlife and humans, there's the question of what are these things that we are either ingesting or inhaling, what are they doing? And as you say, that's really a pretty new avenue of research. And I think the bottom line right now would be no one knows exactly what the health implications are.
So something I was listening to an interview that one of the guys who wrote one of those books did, and he said something very interesting about it, that nobody puts the table of, you don't, I mean, like with food, you have to say what's in it, even the list of the kind of stuff that is nothing that you know, as Michael Pollan would say, that is nothing that your grandmother would recognize, but you never have to say what's in plastic. And in fact, plastic is made up of all sorts of things, but it's principally oil, isn't it? Or it's oil based.
Yes, it's these long chains of hydrocarbons made usually or almost exclusively from these sort of byproducts or sometimes purposeful products of refining fossil fuels, either oil or natural gas. And then you take those molecules and you often add a lot of, as you're saying, a lot of other, what I will use the not technical term, just basically crap. I mean, all sorts of things get added, either for water resistance, for color, for flexibility, just many, many additives, so many that, people can't even keep track of them. We're talking about many, many thousands of different chemicals that can be in plastics, and many of them can be in the same plastic, and they can break down then into new chemicals. So there is, there are just so many variables here, and people are just beginning to do the kind of testing as to what potential health impacts they could have. One thing I think that's particularly concerning, these forever chemicals, PFAS, as they're sometimes called, that are used for water resistance, that are now turning up in the States, at least in drinking water supplies, sort of known or suspected carcinogens. Those are in a lot of plastics for water resistance. Are those, leaking out of plastics once we discard them, or even before we discard them?
And you made the point also that in terms of like babies' bottles, as the milk gets, or the formula gets swirled around, it's picking up tiny little bits that you can't see and you can't have any awareness of.
Yeah, I mean, there are pretty recent studies that have found, that was a pretty recent study of formula, what, in the sort of normal course of making formula in a plastic baby bottle, how much plastic babies are drinking. But, there are also now studies that have shown that microplastics are in placentas, human placentas. That's quite recent research, but so really what we're finding is now microplastics are everywhere, and they're in kids even before they're born.
It's an extraordinary experiment that we're playing on humanity, isn't it? That this stuff is going into our blood systems, and some of it is known carcinogenic. Have there been any, before we get on to how we might or might not recycle it, which certainly from the British end of it is pretty not such a great story, have there been any proper legislative attempts in the USA to get on top of plastics, or to make plastic manufacturers declare what they're doing? Or is it in fact just that big oil, now seeing the end of the road maybe for their direct fossil fuels, are putting a lot of their energy into making more and more plastic?
I don't know of any very serious efforts to make plastics producers, list every ingredient that's in plastics, which honestly, could be a list as long as your arm. In terms of what the oil companies are doing, I think, there's been a lot of chronicling of that, there are huge complexes all around the world. Plastic demand is going up. It's not going down. And as I say, that is partly a function of increased plastics use in the developing world. Places like India, plastics use is rising very, very fast. And, the oil companies definitely see plastics manufacturing as a way to use these resources that, maybe I will not say, oil demand is dropping, but I hope it will be dropping. It seems to be plateauing, at least, as a way to prolong the life of oil. And there are huge complexes going up in the States, I know, plastics manufacturing complexes.
How did, before we get to the recycling, something that really interested me about the question of how much plastics is in your clothes, like I'm wearing a quote cotton jacket, but not that long ago, a few weeks ago, a very close friend of mine was wearing what was sold to her as a cotton shirt. And she passed her arm across a flame that she hadn't realized she'd left it on a stove, and it went on fire. And it went on fire in a really scary way. I mean, she was terribly badly burnt, and the whole shirt just went up. And it was, a pure cotton, sold as a pure cotton shirt. It obviously wasn't. It obviously had some kind of something in it that made it so flammable.
Well, I certainly can't, speak to exactly what she had been sold. Right. But I think there are statistics, certainly over half the clothes that are made these days contain some synthetic fibers, and that means some kind of plastic. So every time, this is like a fleecy thing, this is pure, synthetic fibers. And the concern about that is that these fibers are, as I said, they're being shed, and people talk, especially in the washing process. And also another concern that I'll raise is that people who work in the synthetic fiber industry, it's been known for quite a long time that they have very high lung cancer rates, and there's a sort of suspicion that drawing these fibers into your lungs is the reason. And so if everything we're wearing is shedding these little fibers and we're breathing them, you could kind of do the math and say that's probably not a good idea.
Yeah, it's very scary. So when we get to recycling, I mean, here in Britain, we used to have a deal with China that we used to send them our old plastic, and then not that long ago they said, "Hey, we don't want this anymore." So we started sending it to all sorts of strange places, and there were terrible stories that came back when people investigated what happened. We found rubbish tips in Turkey, and children, like 3-year-olds, climbing over these mountains of ghastly British plastic with all the logos of Heinz and whatever on it. The world is completely, not on top of what to do with this stuff, are they?
Yes, you're exactly right. I mean, we in the developed world used to send vast majorities in the US and Europe, vast quantities of plastic to China. In China, it got melted down, often under environmentally, disastrous conditions, and reused. And then the Chinese eventually, had enough of that, in part because they developed their own, industries. They didn't need our crap anymore. And so they said they were not going to take it anymore. And that caused a tremendous crisis in, what is called recycling, but, may just have been, in many cases, just shipping off to China for them to do whatever they wanted to do with it. And as you say, that crisis resulted in, where there was money to be made. There was now all this stuff looking for a home, and a lot of countries accepted it under very shady circumstances, and suffered the consequences. And honestly, where that stands right now, I don't know the answer to that, what we are all doing. There was this kind of crisis that was precipitated just a few years ago, and I think people are still sort of trying to sort out what to do now.
But we all want to believe that whatever plastic we've got, when we stick it in the bin marked recycling, that something brilliant happens. But you're saying, I think it's correct in what I'm saying, that you that you can't endlessly recycle plastic anyway, and some plastic you can't recycle.
Right. So there's this, general sense, many people have written about, that as long as it has a little number in it, inside those little arrows, that it's, recyclable. And the truth turns out to be that very few, that little number refers to, what kind of plastic resin is used in the plastic. And very few kinds of plastics, only plastics 1 and 2 are recycled with any regularity, and all the rest are not. And even with plastics 1 and 2, people would point out they're not really, generally they're not recycled, they're downcycled. You can't take that plastic soda bottle, let's say, and turn it into a new soda bottle. That's a very clear plastic, it's very high quality plastic. And once you melt it, and if there's any contamination in it at all, you don't get food quality plastic. It doesn't have that brilliant clarity anymore. So these things tend to get downcycled into things like fibers for carpet, let's say. You'll sometimes see playground equipment that say this was made with recycled plastic. So you can downcycle plastics, but they're very hard to recycle. Maybe you could get one more use out of them, or once again, but you can't just keep reusing. It's not like aluminum or glass where you can melt it down and form the same product again.
You quote a young woman called Eve Schwab, who tries very hard to follow what happens to her old plastic, and the results aren't that brilliant.
No, I mean, this is a woman who really, spent a year really trying to cut down on her plastic, figure out where her plastic was going. And she follows a variety of different threads, and wherever she follows them out, it's kind of disappointing. So one example is this company that, promises to recycle the unrecyclable. It's very difficult to recycle, and they charge quite a lot of money for you to send, your old plastic toothbrush and just whatever, kind of plastic that don't fit into normal categories. And they turn out to be sort of scandal plagued and have basically, not lived up to actually recycling this stuff. In one case, it's found to be being dumped in the burn kiln in Bulgaria, so it's not a pretty picture.
I don't know about your local shops, but I mean, I know every supermarket or shop I go into, they give you these things now called bags for life, which are people end up with a whole lot of. But you also say at some point that to have lower environmental impact than a plastic bag, in actual fact, you've got to use a cotton tote 7,100 times. Is that right?
Well, that was a figure the Danish government did a survey. I think there are many different figures that you can come up with. That one is, on the high side, but the environmental costs of that, cotton tote, that organic cotton tote that you have, that you're replacing those single-use plastic bags with, definitely it has to be used many times, not, tens of times, absolutely, quite possibly hundreds, even maybe thousands, by some metrics. I mean, once again, it depends what metric you're using to make it worth, not taking that plastic bag. And then, as you point out, I mean, it's embarrassing. I have a pile of bags that I've simply been given, not even purchased, that, I would probably take many lifetimes to work off, the environmental costs of having produced those bags. So we've, quite possibly, I don't want to say exchange one environmental problem for another, but we've possibly, tipped over into another set of environmental problems.
I think that's really really fascinating, that feeling that we go from one problem and we try to solve it with another problem. I'm just going to go on talking with Elizabeth for a bit, but I can see questions coming in, so do start putting them in, because we'll start coming to them in about 10 minutes. But picking up on what you said just then, and very much now, I think, going back to Under a White Sky, and the fact that it seems that we've whizzed past the 1.5 limit in the month of September, and everything that we hear about on the news now, that this question of how, whether, will we be able to actually extract CO2 to try to reverse the unintended consequences of everything that we have done, of which plastic is one. Where do you see that technology sitting at the moment?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. There is a parallel. You know, there are people working on these machines to get plastic out of the ocean. You know, can you send these sort of booms around that filter plastic out of the ocean? And on a small scale, that's probably possible. And that's the same thing I would say of carbon dioxide removal, which is a big issue now and is going to be an increasingly big issue as we move forward. This notion that not only do we have to stop putting CO2 into the air, which, to be perfectly honest, we're not stopping that. We continue on our merry way. But we we need to actually take CO2 out of the atmosphere. That's energetically quite demanding. CO2 isn't naturally coming out of the atmosphere except into trees. You do hear people talk about, well, we need to plant, trillions of trees. And so, carbon dioxide removal is very difficult. It can be done. It has an energy cost. So then you think, well, how are you getting the energy to do that? And are you adding more CO2 into the atmosphere by doing that? It's very difficult to do at scale, virtually impossible to do at scale. Some people would say if you think about how every single bit of our infrastructure right now is involved in adding CO2 to the atmosphere. So then you think you have to, in order to counteract that, you'd have to have an infrastructure that's just as big taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, and you'd have to put that CO2 somewhere. And that's a very, very, very tall order. So I think that, there is probably a role for carbon capture and carbon removal, but it is not going to be nearly as big enough to make a dent in our CO2 emissions. So really what we need to be concentrating on is not putting it up there in the first place. And ditto with plastics, we could remove some of it, but really we need to just not put it in the oceans to begin with.
Yes. I mean, I have a friend who is working on trying to take carbon out of the atmosphere, and in a brilliant bit of irony, put it back into the cavities and under the North Sea, where the North Sea oil was. And it's just such a strange thought. But she's convinced, A, that can work, and B, that we won't solve this problem unless we think about new technologies, because that is the kind of impulse of humankind, and that to say go back or stop is actually never going to happen. So therefore we've got to try and come up with yet another. I mean, it's a bit like, what happened with New Orleans in your book, that you keep having to add something, you keep having to do something, but that in the end of the day, that's the way that the human race operates, is about going forward rather than going backwards. And I just wanted to know what you thought about that.
Well, that's completely the subject of Under a White Sky, that human impulse, and the question of whether that human impulse, it's certainly taken us a long way. It's taken us to today. There are 8 billion of us on the planet. So on some level, you could say, well, it's worked out pretty well for us. That being said, there are no guarantees here. I think that, you start, I'm not a material scientist, but you do start to bump up against the limits of physics and chemistry. And, one of the problems that we have is that fossil fuels they carry a lot of energy, and then they release a lot of CO2 when you burn them. You get the energy and you have the CO2, and then the byproduct is the CO2. If you want to reverse that process, as I say, you need to use energy. And that's where, you start bumping up against the laws of physics. It's doable. But and maybe people will come up with some brilliant way to overcome, what seem to be these absolute barriers of physics and chemistry, but so far they have not.
What do you feel about as the title of your book, Under a White Sky, the shooting of either diamonds or sulfur or whatever it would be to try to block the sun? Is it crazy?
Well, it's that's sort of the ultimate question. That's the ultimate question. Is it crazy, or is it, our last hope? And I don't have the answer for that. I think this last year brought home for people in a way that maybe they hadn't felt before, how dangerous these changes are, how dangerous climate change is. And we are just seeing the beginning now. It's not getting cooler, it's only getting hotter. And so the question of, whether we're going to have to look seriously at other forms of, tampering with the atmosphere, that what you're alluding to is this idea that we would, literally block some sunlight from hitting the earth by spraying some kind of reflective material in the stratosphere. It's either, it's been described, as unimaginably drastic, a highway to hell. And it's also been described as inevitable that we'll do that, because as you're saying, well, we're not very good at going back or reining ourselves in, but we're very good at reaching for the next technological fix. So I don't know. It's not 100% clear at this point that it's even feasible. I guess the one thing I would say this evening is that, you're going to hear more and more about it. It's not going away, this idea.
I think that's true. I think that things become increasingly, as you say, this last year has been absolutely astonishing. I mean, we've had floods here in the UK that have now, I think tonight, claimed their fifth life. Just suddenly, kind of out of the blue, places that never usually flood. Really drastic stuff, people being stuck in their cars. And and at the same time, we have a government that is saying that we roll back the EVs, we'll give out licenses in the North Sea. And there's a kind of extraordinary disconnect between where the politics are pretty much worldwide and where the reality is outside your door, or indeed inside your door, if you're in somewhere that's just getting hotter and hotter. And it's very hard to understand how we're going to bring that together, since even with, say, we make people pay 10p for a plastic bag, but it hasn't made any difference or a dent into the acres of plastic that are in the world. As you say, the manufacturer continues to go up.
It's very difficult when you have these, you could argue, really, we're just in uncharted territory. Until pretty recently, we weren't capable of creating global environmental problems. We were, capable of causing local and even maybe regional environmental problems. We just really weren't capable of causing global environmental problems. And now we are. And you can only solve a global environmental problem, globally. And our institutions clearly do not seem up to that. And so everything is very much an open question, of what happens next. And I think people are understandably very pessimistic. I myself am very pessimistic about the ability of our institutions to grapple with these unprecedented problems.
Yeah. Well, on that rather pessimistic note, let's have some questions from the audience. Imam Hani asks, says, thank you. What What about the newly discovered bacterium rhodococci that digests plastic, which is found in soil and aquatic environments? That's really interesting because the world is waking up to the wonders of fungi and such like.
Yeah, I think there is interesting research. I mean, there are these plastics are made out of, what were organic material, right? I mean, oil was, vegetation from, many, many, many millions of years ago that, was basically cooked in just the right way and remained under some kind of stone rock, barrier for millions of years. And there are, oil eating bacteria. But I think that once again, it's the scale that's so daunting. And it's also the case that, this bacteria might be able to eat, one sort of plastic. But as we discussed, we are making a gazillion types of plastics and we're adding all this. We're adding to it some chemicals that are absolutely, not found in nature at all. So to be able, to imagine that we're going to come up with some kind of natural way to degrade plastic, I think is probably not terribly realistic, though, people are certainly working on things. You could genetically tweak certain bacteria. There are all sorts of possibilities. But one of the problems that we have also is, as this stuff is just so dispersed, how are you going to get this stuff where it needs to go, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And it's interesting when you say that about, a natural thing is not necessarily going to be able to come against some of these weird chemicals. Because I was in India not that long ago, and outside every sort of village there are these huge piles of plastic and of waste, which there's nowhere for it to go. Then you realize that, or you're told that all the vultures have gone too, because they have ingested particular disulfram, apparently is the one, and it knocks their kidneys out. And so even in places like the Towers of Silence in Mumbai, they now have to dispose of the bodies by using solar panels because there are no vultures left. And so there's no vultures left to eat the waste, and there's no disposal systems. And it is like an amazing kind of knock-on. Now another question, which is this, i.e. the microplastics, I assume person means, connected to the dropping off of a cliff of human fertility over the last 50 years? That's a really good question.
Yeah, that is a really good question. And I'm afraid I can't answer it. And I don't think anyone can answer it. I mean, these questions of whether, there are these, hormone disrupting chemicals that we all know about and exist, and that people are very concerned are in, water supplies, for example, and our plastics also. Microplastics have a way of sort of attracting poisons. So that's another, fear, that as we ingest these things, they actually are sort of like magnets for certain classes of other chemicals, like PCBs, for example. And are we, ingesting hormone disrupting chemicals with our plastics themselves, microplastics themselves, hormone disrupting? These are all questions that I think no one has an answer to yet, but certainly people are looking at, and certainly deserve to be looked at.
Do you think that the plastic industry itself has a clue of what's happening? I mean, I suppose you think of the fact that ExxonMobil and companies like that had all the facts and data at their fingertips about what would happen if they carried on pushing that much CO2 into the atmosphere from as far back as 1970.
Well, I do want to separate. I do want to say that, plastics and climate change, that is an issue, absolutely. But that plastics are not driving our climate change, crisis. Mm-hmm. Climate change is being driven mainly by the fact that we, combust fossil fuels, and plastics in a way are taking fossil fuels and, putting them into something else that eventually breaks down, but not necessarily in a way that contributes to climate change. So yeah, those are, I just should say that those are somewhat, separate ills from plastics. Now, in terms of, what the oil companies, they certainly, they hide behind the consumer, the big consumers of plastics, buyers of plastics are companies like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Nestle. Those are huge purveyors of plastics, and they occasionally put out these, plans about how they're going to make sure that every bottle they sell gets recycled. Everyone knows those are nonsense, that's not happening. And then, if you ever follow up on any of these pledges, you find that they did not actually live up to any of them.
But we so want to believe. Jessica Bultainer asks if there's a clean way to burn plastic for disposal and use the energy that you create. And does fossil fuel-based fertilizer, that's a really interesting idea, shed plastic into the environment?
So in terms of burning plastic, a certain amount of plastic will get burned, absolutely, in waste to energy plants. And it's, probably pretty energy dense. I think one of the problems is that, as I said, there are many, many chemicals in plastics, so that you can get some pretty nasty things when you burn it, including dioxins. So I'm not sure if there's any very good way to burn plastics, but a lot of it is getting burned. And there probably are better and worse ways to burn it, honestly. So that is an interesting question. I don't want to claim to have the answer to that. As for fertilizer, what happens, the reason fertilizer uses fossil fuels is because we get the hydrogen. It's a complicated process. But basically we use natural gas. It's called stripping. And that's how we use natural gas to make nitrogen fertilizer. And that is pretty unrelated to the whole plastics issue. That's a whole other form of the way that we are dependent on fossil fuels. But I don't think it ties in any clear, straightforward way with plastics.
Thank you. Anita Macri asks, what do you think are the more promising initiatives to deal with the problem at this point? Can we expect moves for a circular economy to make a difference, for example, or the UN's push for some kind of legally binding treaty to reduce plastic pollution?
Well, that's a really good question. There are, as the questioner points out, negotiations going on, not exactly as we speak, but there have been several negotiating sessions for this global treaty to reduce plastic pollution. There's a global treaty to reduce CO2 pollution. We all know how effective that's been. So I think there's definitely growing awareness that this is a really big environmental problem. Whether a global treaty is going to make a dent in it, I don't know. I think one idea that is, pretty interesting and worthy of attention is if the producer, had to take it back, if there were some responsibility on companies that sell packaged goods to think about how that packaging could be recycled or combusted or whatever it is, then you would get a different way of thinking about the problem. And I think one problem that we have is that these plastics, there are often many plastics combined in packaging, so they simply cannot be, disentangled. And that makes reuse or recycling, virtually impossible. So if there was some kind of producer responsibility, then at least maybe the producers would think of creating the most, if they had to take things back, they would have to think about what they were doing in ways that they don't have to now.
I think that's a really, really good point. And the whole thing about extended producer responsibility is one of the keys to this. But we have, difficulty even trying to get a refund scheme on bottles, so that you'd get I mean, when we were kids, you used to be able to take bottles back to the local shop and you'd get a few pennies, and it was quite a good trade, really. And it made you respect the thing, that it had a kind of intrinsic value, even though you'd remove the contents. And we have lost that capability, I think, of the way we look at that. But I think it's, I mean, the European Union is doing a lot on extended producer responsibility about things in terms of disposal, and also in terms of things that to try to get you out of the buy a new one culture, because that's cheaper than fixing it, whether it's your toaster or your kettle or whatever. You just bung it out. Mariam Matthew asked a very interesting question, which is slightly different, but I'm totally interested in what you think about this. It's basically, what can we wear? Because as she says, leather and fur aren't animal friendly, and cotton is one of the greediest water-wise, and indeed in terms of, I think, pesticide use. And so is there a synthetic that's a good thing? Or what should we do apart from buy clothes from charity shops and buy secondhand? Is there a, I mean, certainly the quote sustainable clothing lines that we have in the UK are really expensive. They're kind of elite.
I think, yeah, I think what we're learning, after having, tried everything else, is that, there's nothing that you could do at scale. Once again, so you think about clothing, 8 billion people, that is, really, that doesn't have an environmental impact. How's that? Yes, either growing the cotton or making the synthetic fibers, or whatever wool obviously has a big environmental impact, sheep, leather, whatever you do, is going to have an environmental impact when multiplied by 8 billion people. And I think that the first step here, and it's the easy one, it's the low-hanging fruit, as it were, is we all have way more clothes than we wear, right? I mean, so that in the sort of global north, and when you think about, not to depress everyone further, but in this moment of time where we should be, producing less, we actually have now it's called fast fashion. Nothing could be kind of crazier than that, than having clothes that are literally designed to be worn a few times, tossed, so we really, I think, have in that world, in the clothing world, the first and second and third step is to just buy a lot less, and then in terms of what would what is the best kind of garment to buy, the first answer to that is none, and the second answer to that is I'm not sure. I'm not sure which pair of shoes, the synthetic ones, the leather ones, probably the synthetic ones on many grounds have a lower environmental footprint, but maybe when it comes to disposal, they have a higher environmental footprint. So it's these life cycle analyses are complicated, and it depends on what variables you're focusing on often.
God, it's complicated. Jeff Wint from Oceanwise says, it sounds like the plastic pollution crisis is the systemic challenge that the industry needs to take a lead. I agree with you there. But then he says, what role does the individual need to play to move the system to a lower plastic future?
Well, I do think that, because a lot of plastic, not all certainly, but a lot of plastic is in very consumer-facing products, that public pressure is, important, because these companies are very concerned about what consumers think. So if they thought that, consumers, once again, there is a fair amount of low-hanging fruit. This doesn't solve the problem, but it would be a very important first step. Our packaging, a lot of our packaging is ridiculous. Things are, completely over packaged. Everyone knows that, who, buys anything, that you can barely get it out of a package often. So I think that, if companies felt like, people were paying attention, and that would mean, letter campaigns or public pressure campaigns, they would change the way they do business when it comes to directly interfacing with customers.
Yeah, I agree about that. We're right up to time now, and so I'd like to end on a question from Lucy Carrigan, who says, Rebecca Solnit says it's not too late. Do you agree?
I guess the question is, too late for what? Yeah, I mean, it's not too late to make a big difference. Is it too late to, keep temperatures from rising, more than 1.5 degrees C over pre-industrial times? Probably. Is that going to have cascading impacts that we will not be able to control? Quite possibly. But one of the facts about our situation is that we kind of have to act in the hope that it's not too late, even though for many creatures and ecosystems, it may be.
Well, thank you. Elizabeth, thank you so much for giving us your time tonight. That's so many thoughtful and interesting things. And as I say, the details of Elizabeth's books are in the chat. And if anyone wants, there's a recommendation of a film in the Q&A as well. That was just brilliant. There's so much to think about, and it's like with so many of these issues, you start with one not small thing, but one thing like plastic, and you find that it sort of takes up the entire problem, could be seen through the auspices of that. And sometimes you can see some solutions. I hope there are, and then please keep writing, because you're really inspirational to everybody. And so thank you all very, very much for joining us, and thank you all for your questions. And I'm sorry I didn't get to them all, but come back soon, and good night.
Thanks so much, everyone.